Hello, everyone. I'm Hap SHASHY, tax partner at King & Spalding, and I'm the moderator of this panel on tax policy and manufacturing. Thank you for joining us. I have the easiest job in the room because we have an outstanding, highly qualified panel that I will introduce to you serially as in order of appearance. We are particularly honored today to have with us Congressman Tom Reed, but we only have him for a brief period of time. So he's going to lead off for us. Congressman Reed has been a member of Congress since 2010. He represents the 23rd District of the great state of New York. He's a member of the Ways and Means Committee. He's a member of the House Manufacturing Caucus. In 2014, he sponsored a bill that became law. It's the Revitalizing American Manufacturing and Innovation Act. So he has an authentic and demonstrated passion for improving U.S. manufacturing. Let me, in light of time constraints for Congressman Reed, let me turn the floor over to him. We're anxious to hear your thoughts, Congressman Reed.
Well, thank you so much, Hep, and thanks for the introduction. And as we had to cancel our meeting with Secretary Liu to be here with you today, I thought this was a more important panel to be part of. But the chairman is taking care of that 385B meeting with the Treasury Secretary as we speak. So just happy to be here with you. Happy to be here to highlight U.S. manufacturing whenever we have an opportunity, being the co-chair on a bipartisan basis of the U.S. Manufacturing Caucus, and a firm believer in U.S. manufacturing. Anytime we can promote U.S. manufacturing and have a discussion about policy that's going to advance U.S. manufacturing interests, we're going to participate. And one of the things that I think we can do in order to advance U.S. manufacturing is take a hard look at the tax code. Obviously, taxation is a fundamental policy that impacts where our manufacturers are, their potential opportunity to grow. And as you know, one of the top priorities in Congress today is creating jobs of today and tomorrow. And so as we look at where we have been, I think you need to take a moment to recognize the efforts that have been completed on the committee, as well as legislatively, when you look at the end of the year last year, when you look at the PATH Act, when we made permanent things like the Research and Development Tax Credit, made permanent Section 179 deduction for our businesses. That, I hope, sends a message to you and to others across the country that there's many of us in Washington that are committed to adopting permanent tax policy that's going to advance American manufacturing interests. And as we look at that success, we want to look forward and to really highlight the top priority that we are focusing on, not only on the committee, but in our office and as part of the U.S. manufacturing efforts here in Washington. We just rolled out the blueprint. This comes on the heels of the Dave Camp proposal, and the Dave Camp proposal where we went to the tax code and we were able to rewrite the tax code in a revenue neutral and distributionally neutral manner to show that it can be done. And now we're dealing with the blueprint to show kind of the next step as to how we want to advance the cause of overall tax reform. And as we go into tax reform, there's three guiding principles that I will share with you that we have adopted internally in the committee in regards to tax reform. We want to make the code simple, we want to make it fair, and we want to make it competitive for the 21st century. And so as you look at what we've rolled out in the blueprint, it's meant to be a starting point of the conversation. And I know the devil is in the details, especially in tax policy. But things like immediate expensing, things like border adjustability are put in the blueprint to try to send a message that we want to stand with small business America, with manufacturing in America, and we want to promote growth as much as we possibly can. So we think expensing is the right way to go. We think border adjustability with the right definitions when it comes to tangibles and intangibles and other issues there make us much more competitive, at least on an even and fair playing field. And so we're looking for input to make sure that as we have the debate and discussion about the blueprint, this is not a bill that we want to pass to figure out what's in it. We want to make sure we have the conversation up front in an open and honest way. And as we continue the discussions, let's, I hope, take a sincere look at the proposal for what it's worth, and that's meant to advance the cause as we go forward. I think 2017, I know another panelist is going to Potentially, I think Pat's going to handicap where we are with tax reform. But I really do believe that tax reform, the stars are aligning in 2017. There is not a single elected official that I know that's either in office or that is running that is defending the United States tax code. And we had a quick chat with Hap, who came into the IRS shortly after the 1986 reforms. That's the last time we did this. This code is antiquated. It needs to be brought up to modern standards, and I'm very optimistic. And when you got presidential candidates on both sides of the aisle making a commitment to this as a priority, I think there is an opportunity in 2017 really to see the stars align and we get tax reform to the finish line. So I look forward to your input. I look forward to this conversation and just really do appreciate the opportunity to be up here with my fellow panelists who are much more of an experts in this field than I. But I will assure you and I will assure them, our door is always open to make sure that we get this right for the American people. So with that, thank you.
Thank you, Congressman Reed. Do you have time for a question or two if people here have questions for you before you leave? Sure. Okay, anyone? Questions, comments? There'll be time later after the other panelists present to do this again, but for Congressman Reed, sure.
Yeah, hi, Congressman Rob Atkinson, ITIF. Thank you for all your leadership on manufacturing policy. I didn't hear you talk about Mr. Bustani's proposal on an innovation box. I'm just curious what your thoughts are on that, where you think it may be going, and how it might get incorporated or not.
Well, I appreciate that, and I know Dr. Bustani is doing a yeoman's work on that front. What we're looking at on the blueprint and into tax reform is taking a holistic approach at it and encouraging domestic innovation, encouraging domestic manufacturing, domestic opportunities there, and that's what I think the innovation box is all about, is protecting that intellectual property here on American soil. So I think you're going to see that ingrained into the tax reform debate, and I think you'll see those concepts as part of the overall debate. Oh.
Hi, Congressman John Arnett with Copper and Brass Fabricators Council. Could you describe in more detail what you meant by border adjustability, whether it's a VAT tax or consumption tax of some sort?
It essentially is going down the path of a consumption-based tax, border adjustability. It is not a VAT. This is something a little different, a little unique, but it's still fundamentally at its core a consumption-based tax. And what we're trying to do is, at a minimum, make sure that our domestic manufacturers aren't saddled with both the foreign and domestic taxes. And what we are trying to do is make sure that it's just a one tax burden, if you would, especially when we're competing internationally with international markets where right now we get saddled with the dual tax. And so that's what we're trying to equate. And the other thing is the devil is in the details. We get that. We've had some concerns with some folks that do imports into America. And so the question is, what is an import? What is tangible? What's intangible? That is still work to be developed, and that is still a conversation that we want to have with the international market, especially when it comes to the importers as well as the exporters. Thank you.
Anyone else? Okay, well, very, very good. And Congressman Reed, stay with us as long as you can. Thank you very much for joining us.
We appreciate it. When the bells go off, I'll have to leave, but I will stay as long as we can.
Okay, great. So you've heard some of the theme already of this panel. We have a tax system that is characterized by high rates, complexity, unfairness, unevenness, uncertainty, structural anti-competitiveness. Apart from those things, it's a pretty good system. But we have those things, and you should have a paper, and hopefully you've been able to read the paper that describes those characteristics of the tax system and also describes 4 specific suggestions we would make, this panel would make, to the incoming president and to the Congress of things that could be done to improve the tax system. And so we're going to talk about these things. We're going to do it against the backdrop of the current campaign cycle. We have 2 candidates for president, each of whom has focused to some extent on taxes, not in a lot of detail, but it's clear that each of the candidates would like to stem the exodus of manufacturing jobs from the U.S., but they take very different approaches, I believe. The headline for Donald Trump is to reduce tax rates if he becomes president, corporate and business income tax rates dramatically to 15%, whereas it appears Hillary Clinton would double down on the existing system of corporate and business taxation. So very different approaches, but both with the same goal. Our next speaker is to my immediate left. He's our economist and academician, Don Bruce. And Don is the author of the paper that's the centerpiece of this panel, so he's going to talk us through that and some of the things that we've already mentioned today. I'm going to introduce Don, and I'm going to read his title, because Don you get the award for the longest title. I love this title, so it's impressive. Douglas and Brenda Horn Professor of Business in the Boyd Center for Business and Economic Research in the Department of Economics at the University of Tennessee. Try saying that 3 times very fast. So that's great. As a Boyd Center economist, Don provides nonpartisan research and analysis to federal and state agencies on a wide variety of topics. He's also an expert in the economic and behavioral effects of tax policy, and he's engaged regularly by a number of organizations to consult in that arena. And he's consulted, for example, for the National Association of Manufacturers, very relevant to this conference, also the Small Business Administration, and even the Internal Revenue Service. So with that, let me turn the floor over to Don. And Don, would you walk us through the paper? And we appreciate that.
Thank you very much, Hap. I promise not to read it or walk you through every ounce of it. We only have a few moments here, but I do want to thank you and your colleagues at King & Spalding and our great colleagues at Indiana University for hosting this event and for including us. I do also want to echo your acknowledgement of the National Association of Manufacturers, who supported the work that I'm going to be talking about this afternoon. And our piece really focuses on 3 elements of this discussion. First of all, what are the major issues, the problems with the current business tax system, the specific aspects that need to be addressed as we go into this alignment of stars, if you will, in the coming year. Second, what are the opportunities on the table for making meaningful change? And then, in my view as an economist, from what I think of as the Orange Tower in Knoxville, what are the barriers? What are the real issues that are getting in the way? And I'll go ahead and highlight at the beginning, the problems are fairly obvious. Our tax rates are too high. Our rules are mysterious at best and unstable, subject to frequent reauthorization and renewal. And then the system is set up to drive activity elsewhere. And we have opportunities in the form of economic growth that I'll outline for you this afternoon. In terms of the barriers, I want to get straight away to a couple of the points the Congressman made. And it seems that we're really, I think, too focused on revenue neutrality and distributional concerns, limited specifically to business taxes. And I want to spend most of my time talking about those issues. Let's start with the rates. It's no secret that the United States top corporate tax rate approaching 40% when you consider the state tax system along with the federal rate is extremely out of line with where things have been going among our primary trading partners, the G7 and the OECD average now approaching 25%, while we're still near 40%. And the most obvious cost of this is what economists refer to as distortion of activity. You have very clear incentives to reorganize your activity as best you can, to reduce your activity if possible, and in the worst possible outcome, move it elsewhere and take that economic benefit away. And that places us, our rate places us at a competitive disadvantage. So this really is a primary competition issue. And my main point about the rate is that the argument that most businesses don't pay the top rate is a bit silly, in my opinion. To argue against a rate cut by saying that businesses are already very good at getting around it doesn't make a whole lot of sense. So turning to the issue of tax rules, we focus our work on investment policy, cost of capital policy, things that we've been very happy to use in terms of stimulus, like depreciation rules that are extended, enhanced for the purpose of stimulating the macroeconomy rather than for the purpose of having good tax policy or being economically neutral in the marketplace. this menu of depreciation rules that we have and the finally permanent R&D credit, which recognizes the important spillover benefits of business research and development activities, creates a wedge between assets of very similar assets that happen to be classified differently or be taking place in different industries. And there's a simple fairness issue there. If we're really interested in fairness and simplicity, cost of capital policies would be a great place to start. And what we talk about there are things like expensing instead of complex and non-neutral depreciation rules, things like enhanced and not just permanent research and development tax credits, due to the very known and tangible spillover benefits that those activities generate for the macroeconomy. The third piece in terms of the current playing field that I do want to mention is that our treatment of multinationals is extremely outdated, and we're now in the very small minority of countries who still tax multinational enterprise on the basis of worldwide income rather than income earned strictly within our borders. 28 of 34 OECD nations have adopted territorial tax structure, 15 of those since 2000. We find ourselves increasingly at a competitive disadvantage, but worse yet, the system is set up to promote the offshoring of profits in the excess of $2 trillion by recent credible estimates. Those taxes would not follow that money until it's repatriated back to the U.S. So we were commissioned by the NAM to study the potential economic benefits of a platform that they think is fairly simple, fairly universally agreed upon, a lower corporate rate of 25%, a territorial structure for multinationals, full expensing for investment, permanent and enhanced research and development credit, and importantly, a parallel set of changes for non-corporate pass-through entities that pay their tax through the individual system. And I'll go straight to the punchline there. We estimate, based on a large body of research contributed by many of you in this room, that in sum, those things could add up to a percentage point of GDP growth on an annual basis, adding up to $12 trillion over 10 years, about a percentage point and a half of investment growth on an annual basis, adding up to $3.3 trillion over 10 years, and on the average of 500,000 jobs per year, or 6.5 million over 10 years. And those are non-negligible, sizable impacts that we have to have on the table as we discuss corporate tax reform and business tax reform more broadly. So what's keeping us from making progress? And this is where I really want to focus my effort. It seems like that we go into every tax reform discussion with a limitation on the front end that the policies be revenue neutral. And our view, I think the view of many public finance economists, is that business tax reform is critical and necessary, but it must take place within the context of a broader set of tax reforms. It is not necessary to assert and require that each particular element of that package be independently revenue neutral, especially when one considers that the budget is far from in balance at this point in time. Revenue adequacy is absolutely an important goal of our tax system, but it must not trump everything else that we care about. My apologies for the use of that word out of context. We still care about things like efficiency and fairness and simplicity and stability, the things the Congressman mentioned. Those are as important, if not more important. And so one of those goals should not necessarily override the others. The second piece is the distributional part. And I'm delighted that distributional concerns have become such an important part of the discussion on tax reform. But when it comes to business taxes, we always have to remember that the burden of those taxes is not as simple as we'd like to think. The common knowledge, the conventional wisdom on the street is that business taxes are fully borne by really wealthy individuals and corporations, and that's just simply not true if you actually take a look at the work that's out there. Who bears the burden of business tax? It's consumers through higher prices, it's workers through lower wages and lower employment opportunities, and it's the owners of capital, which, newsflash, affects anyone with a retirement account. If you've got a 401k or an individual retirement account, you are bearing part of the business tax burden. And we have to always remember that it's people, and in many cases it's low and middle income people, who are bearing the burden of these taxes. So reducing the tax rate on businesses doesn't necessarily mean more wealth for rich people. It could mean lower prices. It could mean higher wages and more employment opportunities. It's incumbent upon businesses to make that point. The most recent research suggests that workers bear more than half and up as much as 70% of the business tax burden. So corporate tax reform, business tax reform could end up being the most important employment reform and employment market reform that we could potentially dream up. Worth considering in the context of what I would view as false requirements for revenue neutrality. And then finally, mobility issues. The old logic from your public finance courses is that you put the highest rate of tax on the least mobile activity because it won't go anywhere and you can raise the most revenue with very little distortion to the economy. The problem there is that everything's mobile now, but the important part of that for this event today is that it's logical to think that manufacturing is perhaps less mobile than many other types of business. And when we have a tax that falls very heavily on the immobile base, we have a fairness issue there in that the most mobile enterprise is able to avoid those taxes more effectively than the least mobile. And so any effort to acknowledge those things would certainly be beneficial to our manufacturing base. So to summarize, we absolutely need revenue adequacy. We absolutely also need stability in our rules. We need lower rates. We need permanence. We need an efficient system that is fair. We need a level playing field for all. We think that would accrue important benefits to manufacturing. But most importantly, it would allow us to have a manufacturing base that can move forward on the basis of good economic decisions and good business decisions and not on the basis of where they think tax policy is going to move in the next year or two. So with that, I look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thanks, Don. So our remaining panelists are both from industry, and they have very different perspectives given what they do. You're going to hear next from Dave Lewis, who's sitting next to Don. Dave is with Eli Lilly and Company, one of the world's premier pharmaceutical companies. It operates globally, and it is based in Indiana, as most of you know. Dave is the VP Global Taxes and the Assistant Treasurer. So he sees the effects of the U.S. tax system and other tax systems up close and personal on a global manufacturer. Dave, you have a long list of leadership positions and leadership roles in the tax policy endeavors, and you also have deep involvement in tax reform here in D.C. You're the board of directors of the Tax Council and also the board of directors of the Alliance for Competitive Taxation, both of which are very relevant to this topic. So, Dave, why don't you give us your take on the blueprint and other matters, and we'll look forward to your comments.
Thank you, and thank you also to IU for having me. As an alumni of their law school, I appreciate that they recognize that they taught at least one person something. And I've tried to apply it ever since. So there's so much to say about the blueprint, about what Don has just shared. But let me start out by, when you're the chief tax executive, you have to have a one-page set of talking points for your CEO and CFO. And my one page could be your paper. It's simply stated, we need to enact an internationally competitive territorial system with a 95 to 100% exemption system on dividends. We need transitional or reasonable transition rules for accumulation of foreign earnings that previously accumulated. We need to avoid anti-base erosion rules that disfavor U.S. companies against their foreign competition. Very critical issue. And then we need to enhance international competitive incentive. We need to enact internationally competitive incentives for innovation. We now have a permanent R&D credit, but should we look at raising it to 17 to 20%? We need to maintain full expensing of R&D expenditures. And we should consider patent boxes or innovation boxes and look at them. I will comment with respect to the Bustani-Neal approach. And then finally, adopt an internationally competitive U.S. corporate income tax rate in the range of 20 to 25%. We are now the only OECD country with a tax rate of 30% or above, and also having a worldwide tax system. And so that's the climate in which we find ourselves doing business today. I would commend to you, if you want to understand the difference between being constrained by revenue neutrality and the other things that Don listed versus what I like to see, and which I've asked why we haven't seen, and that is, why don't we have transformational thinking in tax policy in the United States? And so I began to think, what is an example of transformational thinking? The United Kingdom. In the last 5 years, they've taken their 32% corporate income tax rate to now on track for 15%. They've enacted a territorial system of taxation for foreign earnings. Why? Because companies were leaving. And instead of building the wall higher, they brought them back. They've enacted a patent box focusing on providing incentives to companies that invest significant amounts in patents. They have a very robust R&D credit. They have adopted very targeted and limited anti-base erosion rules. In my opinion, they are a model for transformational thinking. And they haven't had a revenue problem. No one's screaming about revenue in the United Kingdom, which we constrained ourselves with in this country. Now, when I think about transformational thinking, I commend the House Ways and Means Committee for the blueprint. The blueprint throws a lot of those very concepts out and says, what do we need to do to find 4% growth in this nation? And I think they're on to something. We've looked at it ourselves. There are two things that we like. One, we like the overall outcome. Two, in the prior proposals that have been floated, including Camp 1, Camp 2, constrained by revenue neutrality, there were a number of anti-base erosion rules that fell heavily on U.S. headquartered companies. And as a U.S. headquartered company, that's of great concern because I do not want to become more valuable in the hands of others versus our own shareholders. They seem, again, as the congressman said, the devil is in the details, which I told him before we gathered here at this table, but they seem to have addressed that competitiveness issue. And so I commend the blueprint. The last thing I would say is that our industry, well, I've got a lot more that I could say, but the last primary point I would share is that our industry, the biopharmaceutical industry, has been a bit of a poster child in this whole issue of inversions and things, things you're not supposed to say. And I would characterize the dilemma that we have and how tax reform affects that, or the lack of tax reform affects that as follows. If you look at the effective tax rates of U.S. headquartered biopharma companies, and you look at the effective tax rates of the major foreign-owned or foreign headquartered, you'll look, if you average those together, and they're pretty comparable. But there's two things that are different. One is that the foreign-owned companies have access to their global cash because they reside in countries that have a territorial system. So they can redeploy the cash they earn anywhere in the world and redeploy it where it makes most sense for their business. U.S. companies have to defer earnings abroad. We both arrange their affairs in identical ways, but one group gets the cash back. U.S. companies have to defer it and leave it abroad to achieve that tax rate. And if they don't, they'll have tax rates in the neighborhood of that 40% that Don just talked about. And when you have companies at a 40% effective tax rate competing with companies at a 20% effective tax rate, it doesn't take long to figure out who's in a better position. But that's the situation that U.S. companies find themselves in today. And so as that cash accumulates abroad, I began wondering, what does that mean from a competitiveness standpoint, at a next layer of granularity? So we looked at 7 years of M&A data in the biopharma space. And we had to filter it, so we filtered $1 billion and above cash deals, because we're talking about cash. And what we found is that in that 7-year period, 2/3 of U.S. targets were acquired by foreign-owned companies. Now, at a time when we're talking about base erosion, and we're focusing on large companies that might be conducting activities in lower tax jurisdictions, we're wringing our hands about that, and our base is being eroded. The next Celgene is owned by our foreign competition. The next Biogen is owned by our foreign competition. The future Eli Lilly and Company is owned by a foreign competition. And that's what's being lost in the debate today. That's what's being lost in the lack of urgency that we have seen over the last several years with respect to tax reform. And it's what our current laws are driving in terms of results. Last thing, we have been asked to comment on what the next President of the United States should do, and I would throw into the mix something that has united the entire business community like no issue I have ever seen before. And that is the proposal by the administration to issue regulations under Section 385. And this relates to intercompany debt and the ability of the IRS to recharacterize intercompany debt as equity. I would merely say that if these regulations are enacted by the end of the year, the next President of the United States should immediately withdraw them. They are going to fundamentally change the way U.S. businesses conduct business worldwide, how we use cash to deploy it worldwide, and it is already having a significant effect on companies. One, we earn money all over the world, and we're now not dividending it back to the U.S. where it can be redeployed in the United States for American jobs. We are looking at major expenditures for new staff to meet the compliance obligations of these regulations, and we're now convincing our IT people we need to rebuild long-standing cash management systems to comply with the requirements of 385. We are looking at should we engage in third-party borrowing and no longer engage in intercompany lending, which will significantly increase our cost of debt. Now, what are the implications of all these? In our case, that's a lot of money spent, and we're not bringing another new drug into the world. Instead, we're just meeting compliance obligations. And so from a manufacturing sense, that's money not being redeployed in the United States to strengthen our manufacturing, our innovation, and our R&D base. And it is imposing a burden on U.S. companies that are already overly burdened by tax policy that is new and different from what our foreign competition will experience. And so I would say one of the first acts needs to be to withdraw those regulations. On the patent box, I think the Bustani-Neal one was too shallow. It's very broad and too shallow. It needs to be more targeted, much deeper. The U.S. biopharma industry spends about 25% of its sales on R&D, and we were getting ratios to apply to income to qualify for that in the 15% range. The most, the companies spending money like that on R&D probably ought to get a much bigger ratio. And so I would simply suggest on that we need a deeper patent box, more targeted. That's all I have.
Thanks, Dave. Some great thoughts, and in particular with respect to the 385 regulations. We'll come back to a lot of those topics in a moment, but let's hear next from Patrick Wilson. Patrick, as I said before, also comes to us from industry, but he looks at this through the lens of a lobbyist. Patrick is the Government Relations Director at Cummins, Inc., another global operator, iconic manufacturer based in the U.S. Patrick has spent his career basically on the Hill in various jobs in government or in the private sector, but basically all focused on the Hill. Before becoming a government relations director, Patrick ran the D.C. office of the Semiconductor Industry Association, and prior to that served in a number of senior staff roles for the likes of Senator Sam Brownback from Kansas and then Congressman Mike Pence from Indiana. So Patrick, give us your take, and then we'll open this up to discussion.
Thanks very much, Hap. And,
Sure.
I would equate myself to the beneficiary of the work that things like Professor Bruce and David Lewis do every day working as tax experts. I came into the tax policy debate because I was head of the manufacturing caucus as a staffer and in the small business committee, and we had a big crisis with the elimination of the FISC ETI regime, you may remember from back in 2003, which was a benefit that accrued mostly to manufacturers and intellectual property owners in the United States. And there was a very sincere proposal in Congress to take that very narrow tax benefit for manufacturing companies in the United States, and to spread it among all taxpayers in the United States, giving them a tiny 1% tax cut and make it that much harder. And that fight, being in the middle of the trenches for American manufacturing companies, really changed the trajectory of my life, because that's when I came into contact with the semiconductor industry, and I realized, David, that there are actually companies out there that spend more than 25% of their sales on research to make all the electronics and devices that we do, and that was the semiconductor industry, sometimes approaching upwards of 30% of revenue in investing. And that really, once you're around risk takers like that who are literally betting the company every single year on making a further step innovation in technology, you realize what these companies are up against. And I lived kind of in the world of a Capitol Hill staffer, had been a lawyer, and never really been in touch with the risk-taking necessary. So with that, just as where I am, I thought I would give you a taste of what I do every day. So being a lobbyist and having to confront conventional wisdom and politics, I'm going to tell you two stories, okay? So bear with me for 1 second.
We love
It's
stories.
not
No, this is
conventional,
good.
but
This
This
is
is a
good.
very fun story. So imagine, if you will, two kingdoms, right? One kingdom on the right and has a beautiful little castle and a beautiful little town green, and every single Saturday they have a wonderful market where all the people from surrounding areas come, bring their products, and trade. Mercantilism at its best. They set up their little shop on the town green, and they have trade and exchange. There's a nearby kingdom, right, that has a similar beautiful castle, an even lovelier, royal family, and a great moat, and all the things that a great kingdom would have. And they also have a rival marketplace, a little green, where they have some great amenities, and the people who create all the products and goods to bring them to market have a choice about which town green to use. Well, the latter kingdom, with the prettier royal family and the nicer moat, they kept seeing that people kept choosing this other kingdom, the place to transact their Saturday morning transactions, and they were very upset about this. And so the people who would come to their Saturday market kept getting smaller, and they kept thinking, gosh, we're going to make our place better, and if that doesn't work, we're going to build some moats, and we're going to trap people and make them do their economic activity inside of our little kingdom. And if the moats don't work, we're going to get alligators, and if we don't get the walls, we're going to add razor wire, and we're going to decide to force people to have their economic activity inside of our castle. Well, you can probably guess the end of this fairy tale, right? Is that A, consumers can't get into walls and over razor wire and past gators to transact their activity inside your preferred mechanism or preferred place. And they're going to choose the place that's easier, less burdensome, and more attractive to transact their business. That fairy tale is not a fairy tale. This literally describes the economic fight that is happening right now in American politics. There is an entire segment of our political class who's absolutely determined that in this free and open decision about where commerce will take place, the way to win is to build higher walls and hire more gators and get 385 to come and club people to make them do their economic activity in one kingdom versus another. And unfortunately, this fairy tale does not have a very happy ending for that very beautiful and fair kingdom that has high walls and alligators and barbed wire, because it doesn't end well. So that's the first story that I have to tell members of Congress. The second story is a different story. So many of you know Cummins is a thrifty, sort of moral, excellent company based in Columbus, Indiana. We make engines, they're heavy, we bend metal basically every day to make tremendous technologies. If anybody's taken the bus or a train, you've ridden on Cummins technology. In fact, 100% of the buses in DC, both gas and diesel, are Cummins products, but whether it's a Siemens engine or maybe your server farm, right, backed up by Cummins technology, it's everywhere. And we're proud about that. But the amazing thing about being a Columbus, Indiana company is we have to send these very nice men and women from all over America to call on our customers in 200 jurisdictions all around the world. And you have seen these people in the airport, right? You've seen their little bags with their little charts. They're on their way to a sales meeting somewhere, right? You've sat next to them on a plane, surely, in their big tube with their posters, and they're ready to go. Well, guess what we give American salespeople, whether they're selling pharmaceutical sales or they're selling engines in one of the 190 jurisdictions that we have offices around the world? They also take our tax code in their knapsack. They take our regulatory costs, our incredible litigation costs. They take all of that with them. And when they go to call on a client to make a sale, they trot all that stuff out and they say, we make the most amazing engines. We put all this money in research and development to solve customers' problems. But yes, there's more. In addition to the cool, awesome Cummins engine, you also get a really high tax rate that makes our price less competitive, really high litigation costs, really high regulatory costs, and the list goes on, right? And that burden that we put into the suitcase, the knapsack for that saleswoman who's out there trying to sell American products around the world is exactly what the previous two speakers have really talked about, right? Which is what we do to make it less attractive to be an American company competing in the world versus all of our competitors. The British are getting it right, the Japanese got the religion, everyone else is moving in the right direction. So those are my two stories, and that gives you an idea
Good
what
stories.
it's like being a tax lobbyist to try to explain global tax policy to members of Congress. But what I promised to do was kind of handicap a bit, right? So
Please.
we've got
Yes, please.
we've got a great team led by Congressman Reed and a bunch of his colleagues, but certainly Kevin Brady really gets it, right? And the good news about what's happening in the House side is not only do we have a Speaker of the House who really gets it, right, who can be an intellectual leader, but the Democrats, they get it. They come from a lot of manufacturing heavy. Go talk to Tim Ryan, right, from Youngstown, Ohio, the co-chair of the House Manufacturing Caucus. He gets it. They're doing everything they can to make people in Youngstown as competitive as their neighbors. The problem is you can't fix the delta. And that challenge is what is going to confront no matter who wins the presidency. And I guess I would put it to you this way. I was reminded last night when Mike, the CEO of Huntington Ingalls, reminded me of my own axiom, which is every time you go see a customer, every time you go see a member of Congress, you can't think about being a supplicant. You have to think about what their problem is and bring a solutions provider. Be a solutions provider, not a salesman, right? Your customer, your constituent, your member of Congress is trying to solve a problem. So if we back up and say, what is the problem that a future president is going to confront that this Congress can try to solve, or more importantly, what this group of esteemed experts can try to submit as the solutions to that problem? And I would posit that the problem is no growth and no jobs, and there's not meaningful growth that people can feel. When there is a vigorous, growing economy, people know that. Not only do incomes rise, but it really does affect the innovative culture that you're in. People feel more risk tolerant. Think about the woman who will go to her husband and say, I want to mortgage our house, the place where my children sleep, to start a business. That requires a tremendous amount of optimism. And that's what you have to fix with growth. So that's the problem. So the question is, what is a president or what is the Congress likely to do with solving this problem of how do we help people feel like there's real growth? I think that it's closer to what Don Bruce has already said, right? Is that you have to begin by acknowledging that America does not operate in a vacuum. Every single company, whether it's Lilly or Cummins or whomever, right? It's not a question of whether you will serve your customer. It's a question of from where you will serve your customer, always, right? And so we just have to orient ourselves better to answering that question, which is make America the best place to serve a customer from. So what's going to bring about that pressure? Well, right now in the presidential debate and in the fight over who will control the Senate and the Congress, there's a lot of talk about jobs and there's a lot of battering about trade, but there's not a lot of talk about how we stack up against our global competitors. And that's a real delta. We're going to have to hope that that gets refined in the next 60 days, because to get consensus to make the public think about competitiveness, think about the real question of how do we make America better and cooler and a more attractive place to serve, we haven't quite got there yet. So though I share your idea that the urgency of tax reform is still there, gosh, I've been saying that for 5 years, and I have not seen it gelling around the solution to the problem, which is what's going to make people feel like there's a growing economy because we have real growth. And my hope is that whether it's Donald Trump, who has experience in business, or Hillary Clinton, who knows about making compromises, they're going to feel that too, because there just aren't that many levers. So I think we'd be right as a community of experts on tax and other policies to be prepared for a serious debate in earnest in the new year with whoever is the new president about what tax reform will look like. If it's Hillary Clinton and her Treasury Department and what they're going to do, they're going to focus on revenue for infrastructure. They've given every indication that that's what the problem that they want to solve. There are some benefits for manufacturing of an infrastructure investment, but I think it's incumbent on the business community, certainly, but on manufacturers and manufacturing employees to engage both campaigns and more importantly, in these local campaigns, to point out that the choice has to be about where growth happens and where customers are served from. So I'm not as hopeful that we're going to get there, but I see the commitment and the urgency. I just think that to do something really transformational like the UK has done and like the GOP blueprint, it's going to require much more focus on the competitiveness angle that I have not seen thus far.
Thank you, Patrick. So let me ask a question, and I think it's time now to open this panel up to discussion. It's supposed to be a panel discussion, and these things work best when it's not only the panel doing the discussing, but also the audience. So please feel free to make comments or ask questions, but let me lead off with a question for Patrick. We haven't had tax reform, fundamental tax reform, since 1986, and those of us who are old enough to remember when that happened, it really almost was like the stars and the moon aligning. Everyone thought tax reform was dead, and all of a sudden it rose from the ashes in the spring of 1986 and moved forward. And what's going to catalyze that kind of behavior in 2017? We've been talking about tax reform for a long time. Bipartisanship does not seem to be at a high at this point. What's going to cause the parties to come together, regardless of who's in the White House, who controls the houses of Congress? What's going to cause that to happen? What do you see?
Well, the extreme pessimist in me would say that you really need an economic calamity, right? Because it's not our imagination. I have another slide that I use sometimes where I say it's not your imagination that this Congress is really, really partisan. If you look at the movement of the most conservative Democrat and the most liberal Republican over the last decade, it gets closer and closer and closer and closer on a graphical representation. This is a very polarized Congress. And unfortunately, this fight about the two fairy tales is absolutely real. And I don't know what's going to break us out of that, because Bernie Sanders is out there saying, if you do corporate tax reform, you're just paying off fat cats. Notwithstanding what Bruce said about, hey, guess what? Who pays for corporate taxes? Employees pay and customers pay corporate taxes, but there just isn't, that doesn't fit where the rhetoric is.
Can I comment?
Please.
If you look at 1986, and I was a young tot then,
Of course.
there were a few factors. One, you had one single item that would provide a lot of revenue,
True.
which was the investment tax credit. Secondly, you had presidential leadership.
You did. That's right.
And I don't think, if you look back in history, you see examples where you achieved tax reforms without presidential leadership. And so I think in order for something like this to happen, the business community needs to scream loud and long that it's time with the new president. Because I think the only way it happens is you have presidential leadership. Your comment around Hillary Clinton versus Donald Trump, I think if Donald Trump is president, there's a greater likelihood that you have alignment, and it's in terms of the Senate and the House. And if, with alignment, I think you can do more transformational legislation in the first year of the presidency than if you have division. So I would see, and I would expect, if Donald Trump is president, to see the blueprint being the first thing out of the gate. If Hillary Clinton is the president, I can see Paul Ryan, Mr. Schumer, who I think would probably then be in control of the Senate, and a President Clinton focusing on some sort of limited international legislation that would include a mandatory repatriation of foreign profits and using that money to fund infrastructure.
I see. Well, hopefully something short of a crisis will motivate our political leaders to do something.
Less optimistic.
Don, let me ask you a question. You may be familiar with Hauser's Law, but for those of you who aren't, Hauser's Law is the observation that since World War II, in the decades since World War II, across all of the decades, no matter what the configuration of the tax system has been, high rates, broad base, low rates, it doesn't matter. You look across those, all of those years, and income taxes, U.S. income taxes, federal income taxes, seem to, year in and year out, hover around 18% of GDP, no matter what you do with the tax system. And in light of that, is tax reform really that important, and why?
It's critically important, Hap. It's a great question. It's not just about the revenue.
These questions are unrehearsed, by the way. I'm hitting down with this cold.
This is great stuff, though. Revenue, as I said earlier, is not the main storyline here. I think the excellent example from the United Kingdom is that the corporate tax specifically, and business taxes more generally, long ago became economic development policy, not revenue policy. The fixation with the corporate tax as a necessary component of the revenue pie is a little misguided in my view. The states figured this out long ago. For better or worse, the states have been using their business taxes to recruit mobile industry for years. And countries, to no surprise, have been extremely aggressive with this as well, with the exception of our federal government. So the sooner we catch on to business taxes as a development tool, let's water the lawn a little bit instead of digging the moat and filling it with crocodiles, whatever. That recognition, you know, and I don't want to get into static versus dynamic scoring, but one has to be open to the possibility that watering the lawn could in fact generate a revenue dividend on the individual
why
side.
don't you want to get into dynamic versus static scoring?
Well, like our mission, our focus today.
Yeah, it's important.
Well, we have to be open to the dynamic possibilities.
Sure, sure.
And if workers are bearing the burden of our business taxes, and if we can lower the corporate rate and make the system more amenable to American manufacturers and American businesses more broadly, we have to be open to the possibility that that could create an individual income tax dividend, a payroll tax dividend. I mean, I don't want to get into estimating these kinds of things, but I'd be willing to wager they're at least positive. Let's put a sign on it.
And so another way you're saying is that 18% of what, it can either be this small or this big.
Right.
And the growth that these things will engender is that tax dividend.
Exactly. Thank you.
So Dave, let me ask you, as someone as conversant with tax systems around the world as you are, you commented that virtually every industrialized nation has a territorial tax system, lower tax rates, but they also typically have value-added taxes, supplementing their government collections and government coffers. We don't have that. You think in order to do what we need to do on the income tax side in this country, you think it's inevitable that we would have a VAT or some form of VAT-like or consumption tax added onto our income tax? And how do you feel about that?
Well, I think that Michael Gratz has an excellent design for a tax system out there, which is built around, which has been built around a value-added tax. I think he calls it something slightly different. And it's been a little while since I looked at it, but it does contemplate a significant exemption on income for individuals and businesses.
Yes.
And so there's the value-added tax, and then at the very highest of levels, there's an income tax, is my recollection. And so I think if we move in the direction of a value-added tax, and personally I think we'll eventually have to have that conversation in this country, that it needs to be that kind of a construct. It needs to be a construct where we are much less reliant on the income tax and more reliant on the consumption tax. What I think many policymakers worry about is that we just take the income tax system that we have today and layer on top of it additional revenue from a value-added tax, and I think that would be a foolish move. I think you need to sell something like a reform of that nature as, again, transformational. And let's face it, the value-added tax is the least distortive tax, and the blueprint is moving in that direction.
Sure.
And so, you know, it's not out of the realm of possibility if the blueprint were enacted 5-8 years into it, the WTO would say it's not appropriate, and so then we'd finally make the jump to a value-added tax.
Right. Good.
I'd like to add to that if I could.
Sure,
just
sure, Don.
quickly. As I mentioned in the broader paper behind the work that I've talked about today, is to be sure in other countries, the existence of a large-scale value-added tax has enabled lower corporate and other business rates. But we cannot forget about the very robust subnational network of consumption taxes that exists today. I come here today from the great state of Tennessee, where our sales tax rate approaches 10 percentage points.
So we've got it.
We have it already. It has its problems that are well known and well documented, but
Well, and the fact that we have it at the state level may create complications in terms of introducing it at the federal level.
it certainly would.
Yeah,
Yeah.
no doubt. So let's see if there's some questions from the audience. 1 second, Pat. We only have about 5 minutes or so, I think, before we're going to need to wrap, maybe 10 minutes. Then we'll need to wrap up and move to the ballroom where Mr. Spalding is going to give remarks. But yes, gentleman here on the right in the audience.
Thanks. I'm from Pennsylvania, so I'm coming today to look at these manufacturing issues from the perspective of someone who is trying to herd cats, labor, business, other allies to invest in a state-level manufacturing strategy in which the constraints in terms of revenue adequacy are obviously much, I think, tighter. And we also happen to be a state with a very regressive tax system already. And so, I am a redistributionist liberal, but I'm also a productivist liberal. And so we're all for, I wouldn't mind getting rid of all corporate taxes, you know, and making our tax system fairer by taxing, you know, individuals at the top, right? But there's, I'm at Patrick's comment about being a solutions provider. So imagine you're a progressive in a manufacturing coalition, or you're a state legislator who's a Democrat, and you want to invest in innovation. You want to invest in workforce. You know, and more than peanuts, which is usually what states do, except for maybe some of the subsidies. So I guess it feels to me like some of the business partners have to be willing to help in terms of where do we get revenue, and have to recognize that these debates are taking place in a country where inequality has gone up phenomenally. So there has to be some ownership. Again, I think this is even more at the state level, but there has to be some, so, you know, how can you make it easier for people like me to support, let's lower the corporate tax rate, or let's not tax corporations at all. We can't do that unless there's a little more
Shared responsibility.
Sure. Around, you know, we have to get money from somewhere.
Sure. Patrick, you want to react to that?
Well, I'm very taken by that because, you know, Cummins, which is one example, right? We're very communitarian. Like our company is very, we try to be in every community. Think about the billions we spend on educating our employees in the communities, creating community college programs to train people to come into our workforce, all of those things, which actually we could push back and say, hey, our government's supposed to do that, right? Because we pay a lot of taxes. Why aren't you doing it? But instead we try to partner with them to make things happen. But I guess what I would do is tie this together, right? So your state economic development team under a good governor who's focused on manufacturing, like in Pennsylvania, they want to solve a problem. The problem is if they come to Cummins or Lilly and say, hey, come to Pennsylvania, open up a new plant, hire our citizens, a lot of times that economic development team is trying to fix the federal tax code, the back door, right? They're going to have to make all these concessions because you're, as an American company, you're already at a disadvantage. They would actually be better off attracting a foreign company to come to Pennsylvania, right? Because they don't have to make up as big of a delta. You see the fight to get international companies to invest in the United States. They get an advantage, which is crazy, right? And so that's what you kind of have to fix, right? Is how do we stop putting the burden on states to fix the fact that our tax code is so bad from a competitiveness standpoint? I often say that the practical exercise is just elect all of our economic development officers in every state. We should elect just 50 of them all to Congress, right? Because that's where the levers are that they really want to fix, right? You talk to the Tennessee Economic Development Commissioner, as I have, because Cummins has a big presence there. They're really frustrated. They're like, yeah, we can only change so much from Nashville. We're trying to get the feds to stop, making our pitch so bad. And I think that is part of it, the conversation that has to happen, no matter what the politics. Because what they say is, where are you going to serve your customer from? That's where every conversation starts. And if your answer is, come do it from Philadelphia, right? You got to have an answer to why. Why would you choose Philadelphia as a place to serve the customer from? And that usually comes down to revenue.
But if you have a situation, my conversation in Indiana with folks who are wrestling with these same things is that I tell them that it's going to be very difficult for you to compete against the United Kingdom. If a company's looking at the United Kingdom or the United States for investment, it's going to be very difficult, or Ireland, or other jurisdictions of Estonia. Places that have really brought their rates down. It's going to be very difficult to compete from a pure financial analyst standpoint.
The good news is, though, David, we don't have to be as good as them because we have all these other cool things about America. Right? We need to be competitive, but America doesn't have to be the lowest tax jurisdiction.
That's true.
We just have to be better.
That's a good point.
But there are times in these conversations where there's somebody that's looking to invest somewhere in the United States, and that's where states begin to compete. In Indiana, and it goes back into the early 2000s, politics and philosophy aside, we accomplished a significant restructuring of our tax code, and it only happened when business, labor, education, and every party came around a table and put their check their interests at the door and began to talk about the mutual needs of the various constituents. And we had something for everyone in there, but we accomplished eliminating a gross income tax, eliminating an inheritance tax, and a couple other things. We raised the sales tax rate. And for any politician, raising taxes is something that gives them a lot of heartburn. But because everyone was in it together, we were able to get it done. And I think it's going to be very difficult until everyone is willing to give a piece of themselves and engage in constructive dialogue for the good of the state. To my opinion.
I think we have time for perhaps one more question. I think we have a gentleman in the back of the room. Oh, go ahead.
Thank you. Dan Peterson from Cook in Indiana. Thank you all very much. A great panel, great paper, and we fully agree with every aspect. One question, this would be, hopefully the tax reform will happen as you hope and envision and follow those pieces. If it does, it's great. If it doesn't, you're still dealing with other opportunities for improvement. Regardless of the circumstances there, I'm curious how much has there been focus around the manufacturing deduction as it relates to the tax code? That came about as a result of the elimination of the FISC. And, there's been some thought that perhaps that could be narrowed a little bit and go a little deeper and a little bit more substantively to manufacturers, in particular to help American manufacturing competitiveness. Just wondered if that's been in the mix, or is that too much at the weeds at this point to think about?
Who would like to take that?
I'm going to be honest. I think I haven't seen it as much in the mix. I've heard it mentioned once, I think, in the president's framework for tax reform. If I recall, I thought he had a feature focusing around that, but I might be wrong. But when you look at the Camp Draft 1, Draft 2, I think it did away with Section 199 and some of the other proposals I've seen, because the thinking being that if we're bringing the corporate rate down, then we don't need a 199 because you're going to bring it to a level lower than where it is today. I think the president, if I'm recalling the framework correctly, there's something that tells me that he contemplated bringing the rate down to 28%, but then had a manufacturing feature that brought it down to 25. But that's about the only place I recall really seeing it in the mix. Anybody else?
No, I think your answer is right. That's right.
Pitting one sector against each other, it's really hard for manufacturing. I think we wear a white hat and it looks great in the debate, but I still have the stripes on my back from some fights about FISC ETI, right, where I said, why are we giving banks a 1% cut and you're going to raise manufacturing's taxes by 6%? this doesn't seem like a good deal, but the people in this town, right, it's still dominated by the financial services industry and a lot of other sectors that are, kind of not labor intensive. And so it's just I thought you said a great restatement, David, of what it really takes to create a coalition and creating those wedges where you play one sector against another. I mean, that's kind of why we haven't had tax reform today, because everybody has like a favored child in the fight. And it's very, very difficult to do that. I know Cummins has consistently argued that if a lower or much lower rate, closer to 25% for everybody, is really the goal that we want, but it's hard.
So I see someone armed with a microphone.
Yeah,
Yes, sir.
Rob Atkinson, just a quick point on
Right.
that. I mean, clearly what you look at what other countries do and what every state does is they tax their traded sectors lower than their non-traded sectors. And I get your point, Patrick, in politics, but look, the real effective answer here is that corporations and businesses that are in traded sectors should have a lower rate than non-traded sectors. That's what the British have done. That's what a lot of countries do, because they can move. Why do we tax electric utilities at a low rate in this country? They're not moving and going to produce electricity in Canada and ship it to here. They are stuck here. You can raise their rate to 90%, and they're still going to produce electricity. My question, though, Donald, is to you. You talked about pass-throughs, and I guess my question is, why should we? First of all, R&D credit and expensing will go to pass-throughs as well. They'll get that, but it's the corporate rate they don't get. I just don't. I'm really skeptical we should worry about pass-throughs, because pass-throughs already. If you're a corporation, you're taxed twice. You're taxed on your corporate income, and then the recipients are taxed. Pass-throughs are only taxed once. Why should we care about pass-throughs and just do corporate reform and ignore pass-throughs would be what I would propose.
Well, I appreciate that comment very much. In fact, most of my research work has been in the area of pass-throughs and smaller businesses, many of which exist because of that sharp rate differential that has been around. If we have that tax rate or tax rate differential influencing the organizational form, then that's just yet another distortion of activity. So the spirit of that part of the NAM platform is just to be neutral across organizational form and let those decisions be based on what's right for that particular enterprise, rather than maximizing a tax advantage that may or may not translate into more or less economic activity. So I don't know that lowering the corporate rate wouldn't reduce fairly dramatically the number of pass-through entities fairly quickly.
Or integrating corporate and shareholder tax.
Yeah, to take it to the extreme of
Right.
actually full integration, where
Right.
you would have that at the end of the day.
Right.
The marginal rate on the pass-throughs would be a lot less relevant anyway.
Good question. Good
It is
question.
interesting, we really haven't talked about integration, but Chairman Hatch and his team are really pushing
Yes,
the
they are.
concept of integration as a way of offsetting some of that,
Sure.
that issue. And I think that could be, you could see something come out of the House, and you could see the Senate put integration on it in some form.
Well, I think we've reached our time limit. We're getting the sign here. So let me thank the panelists. You guys are terrific. Thank you all very much, and thank the audience.